What's up, Wizards? It's Dev and Digby from Mtg, and yeah, I do think it's about time for that haircut. Now, the other day we put out the Strixhaven standard tier list. Fine video, check it out. But to cleanse our palates of all that nasty meta talk, I figured we'd kind of do the opposite thing today and cover some decks that are powerful, but you haven't played against in the hundreds of times per day. I know it sounds hard to believe, but there are fresh decks in this standard that have shown some promise in big events that I couldn't help but notice as I was combing through tournament data for the tier list videos. So today I'm going to talk about 3 decks that have gotten decent results at some higher level events and not only show some promise, but also do cool stuff. So today let's talk about my favorite thing to talk about on the channel lately, jank decks that can beat decks you hate to play against. The top 3 off-meta decks in Standard. And we're back. Hey, like and subscribe. And as always, remember that if you're interested in deck lists for any of the stuff we talk about today, those are available in the description. All the decks that we talk about, there's a deck list link right down there. There's also some text on screen that might interest you for one reason or another, but aside from that, let's go ahead and jump into it because I got a few decks I want to talk about today, and they're all really sweet, and I want to get to them. Now, the first deck we're going to talk about is maybe the one that I'm actually most excited for, and that's because it's 5-color ReAnimator. You can bet that anytime Rainbow ReAnimator is like a playable thing in a format, I'm going to want to talk about it. Now, this deck recently steamrolled to a 4-2 finish at Coupe de France. Hey, what's up, Ziggy? And that's actually not a bad win rate, especially for a relatively high-profile event. However, I couldn't really find too many other people on this deck. This is basically the only real finish that I could find for it, but it's still basically the coolest deck that I found in my travels, so I figured I wanted to go ahead and shine a spotlight on it here to get more people playing it because it's such a cool list. Full disclosure, the deck is labeled Grixis ReAnimator because it does have a Grixis base, but it uses cards from all 5 colors, especially within the creatures that you're trying to reanimate in the first place, right? Like, all of these are decidedly not Grixis, although they all do share at least one color with the Grixis color combination. But our reanimation suite includes Dream Trawler in this deck, as well as Coma, but most importantly, Velomachus Lorehold. But of course, Dream Trawler and Coma are really good creatures for different reasons. Dream Trawler is good against decks that have a lot of targeted removal, but it's not great against decks that carry a lot of sweepers, whereas Coma, not great against targeted removal the first turn that it's on the battlefield, but fantastic against it for the rest of the game, and pretty good against sweepers too, so long as they're not exile-based. It's even okay against Extinction Event because it usually leaves behind a token or two, so your opponent has to name Odd to pick up the Coma, so that's nice, and obviously both creatures are good against aggro and decks that just don't have a lot of removal in general. But again, the real prize here is Velomachus, because sometimes we can spin this into 5 flying haste damage and another reanimation spell, which is where this deck does the coolest stuff. You get Velomachus for the reanimation spell, you use the Velomachus as attack trigger to get into your library and get another reanimation spell and grab the Coma out of your graveyard. And all this can happen as early as turn 4. That gives this deck this huge degree of explosiveness relatively early in the game, and a really high resiliency stat too, right? Because if we top deck or otherwise draw into a reanimation spell, then suddenly it's on all over again. Even if we didn't start the turn with any creatures out, we can have a Velomachus and another huge dude on the board with just a few mana's worth of investment. And the deck does play enough reanimation spells to hit, and hit early. Sometimes you'll see Return Upon the Tide in this deck because it's the fastest way to get a Velomachus on turn 4 easily in the format, but more often you'll actually see cards like Cauldron's Gift and Unbreakable Bond in the deck boasts as 4 ofs. But again, on occasion you'll see the reanimation spells extended to 10 copies in the deck. You'll fit in a couple of Return Upon the Tide, or you'll do 4 Return Upon the Tide, 2 Cauldron's Gift, whatever. But either way, these are all of the important black reanimation spells in Standard, and they're basically all used in this deck. Now, most of the rest of the deck at this point is just milkshakes. You got to bring your boys to the yard somehow, and Grixis has a lot of really good ways of doing it. You've got Prismari Command, which is probably the best way of putting cards into the graveyard, because you also get to draw 2 cards off of it. It's a dream for just 3 mana for your reanimation deck. You can also affect the board state by shocking a guy, create a treasure token, and these treasure tokens on cards like not only Prismari Command but also Seize the Spoils will really help you in the very late game cast stuff like Coma or Dream Trawler just naturally when you otherwise wouldn't be able to do that. That's not all. The deck also plays Thrill of Possibility always, and Valakut Awakening most of the time, so there's just tons and tons of ways to make sure that you get the right cards in your graveyard and the right cards in your hand, which can be kind of tricky for a reanimation deck sometimes. But we have so many effective ways of doing it right now. I'm surprised more people aren't on a deck similar to this. Because again, the deck has a fair amount of resiliency at this point. It's got an explosive, almost combo-like turn 4 potential play that just wins the game effectively if you can tempo your way into it. But it's also got like a fairly decent, grindy, long game plan where if you can just get one reanimation spell to resolve, you can probably win the game late too, right? So the deck also does play counter spells to help force through a reanimation spell or protect a guy once it's on the battlefield, or just counter like ultimatums or other plays that would go over the top of you, right? We've got mystical disputes. Some decks play disdainful strokes and whatnot, so you will see counters in this deck too, with what very small space we have left after the reanimation spells, the reanimation duders, and the milkshakes. So with what small slots we have left, it's mostly counter magic, but it helps us do a lot right now, you know? I think the counter spells are important in a format with Goldspan Dragons and Alrund's Epiphanies and Emergent Ultimatums and Yorion and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot you have to worry about counterspelling right now that would otherwise just kill you, right? So it's important to run counters, but those same counterspells also give us the flexibility to protect our combo, right? So a lot can be said for just a few main deck mystical disputes and a disdainful stroke or two here and there at this point. So there's a lot going for this deck right now. Again, anytime a ReAnimator build feels real, I'm going to be really excited about that, so I just wanted to pass this knowledge on to you. This deck did do fairly well at a somewhat high-profile event, so maybe you want to give it a shot. It's a really fun deck to play. But let's get to the next one, because we got to look at Esper Tempo real quick, a deck that has not only gone 2-1 at 3 separate big Magic events, so not only is the deck consistent, but at least it's above 500 percentage points. I'll take that. But the deck is also one that has bodied us on stream just recently, actually, and we were all really interested to see what this deck did, because originally it just looked like we were playing against an Orzhov Humans build, and that's a deck that we've covered a tech for on the channel, and actually a deck that I really like too. It's not a bad one, but this one adds blue and explores some really interesting space beyond just counter spells. And yeah, there are counter spells in the deck. It plays mystical disputes and all that stuff, because that's really, counterspells are really good Magic cards right now in Standard, but the deck also does some really cool stuff with its blue mana that I want to talk about. Now, the reason this deck just looks like an Orzhov Humans or an Orzhov Tempo listed first is because it plays Silverquill Silencer, Elite Spellbinder, Skyclave Apparition, all of these kind of tempo-based plays that are mostly above curve, all things considered, and can just wreak havoc on an opponent's hand or board states. So really good tempo-y, annoying cards to have to play against that, especially on the play, can really do some damage to you. But aside from that, they also play Brazen Borrower and Atris in their creature base, which are really sweet creatures, right? Atris is effective card advantage that also comes on a decent body with Menace, and the Menace is relevant too when you're also trying to block Spellbinders and Silencers and stuff. But there's also Brazen Borrower, which is king of tempo in Standard right now, and also has a flying body. So there's just a ton of super annoying tempo that comes on 3/1 flying bodies in this deck. And just when you think you're done dealing with the deck's small-ish fleet of annoying creatures, it plays a card like Ashiok, or Dream Trawler, which the deck carries a couple of copies of most of the time. The deck is equipped all the way through the curve, whether you're talking about, 2 drops or you're talking about 6 drops. The deck has got something for you. The deck will often play ECD or Kaya in the 5-drop slot along with the Ashioks. The deck is not afraid to play a bunch of 5-drop cards and a 6-drop or 2. So again, the deck just has something really powerful to do literally every single turn of the game. It's also worth noting that most of the removal in this deck exiles, we've got ECD in there, but there's also Vanishing Verse. Sometimes it's as much of a 4 of, but more often a 3 of, but more exile removal. Most of the sideboards carry extinction events. If you want to kill creatures dead forever, or even just permanents in the case of Vanishing Verse and ECD, this is probably the deck for you. You never want to have to deal with a thing ever again. A lot of good removal in the deck that does just that. But again, we've also got Mystical Disputes, Disdainful Strokes here and there. So again, the deck is well equipped not only with removal, but also hand disruption, removal on its creatures. It's got counter spells. It's got ways to get important planeswalkers and creatures back that are really annoying to get back, for that matter. And it's got, again, effective exile removal. So, like, lots of really cool stuff about this deck. And even though it's kind of labeled a tempo deck, and it does have a lot of really tempo-y plays, rather than generate tempo for the first few turns, it's mostly just trying to play the most powerful card that it can on the first few turns. But there's also this mode of play that it has where it can just, remove your creature at instant speed with a Vanishing Verse on turn 2, and then maybe Mystical Dispute your turn 3 play, and then it can start playing its Elite Spellbinders and its Ashiok and stuff, and get ahead on board in that way. So the deck has a lot of interesting modes. It really depends on what its opening hand looks like, or whether it goes first or draws first, how it wants to play, but it can play a bunch of different ways, and that's something else that I really like about this deck. In the end, it's a deck with card draw, creature removal, counter spells, threats of its own, planeswalkers. It's just got a little bit of everything, but it all comes together in a really, really sweet way. It's an awesome deck. Now, for our final deck of the day, I had some choices to make because there's a few different decks I wanted to talk about, but I felt like decks like Autumn Burchett's Azorius Blink, popularized at the Strixhaven Championships, have gotten a little bit too much press to truly be considered like, undiscovered jank or anything like that. Same thing with decks like Simic Stompy, or Decisive Stompy, if you want to call it that. Simic Stompy has gone 3-0 in a bunch of like big Magic events. I think it did really well at a League Standard event not long ago. So there, Decisive Stompy, if you want to just play Stompy with a counterspell in it, it's apparently a pretty decent deck, but it wasn't cool enough to really make the list, and honestly, in some ways, it is also too well known. So instead, I decided to focus on a deck that has quietly been evolving over the season, and I'm fairly certain it's the work of just one player. It went from Abzan to mostly black-white to mostly mono-black at this point, but at this point in the season, after a bunch of 2-1 finishes, we finally got a 3-0 finish from a deck that the pilot is calling mono black, but is still effectively Orzhov control. Actually, the deck is technically Mardu, if you want to go that far, but this deck went 4-2 the other day at a Black Pearl qualifier event, which is the best result I could find for this deck. But again, not a low-profile event by any stretch, and a well above 500 win percentage, so I'll take it. I actually think this deck is more than worth talking about, and there's some really interesting card inclusions. In some ways, this is a Super Friends deck. It plays Professor Onyx and Ugin and Valky. That's how the deck is Mardu, technically, is that it's got Valky in it. You can play the Tybalt half of it. But again, yeah, lots of Planeswalkers in this deck, or at least more than you usually see. But Professor Onyx has a lot of stuff to Magecraft with. Ugin is just a game-winning card. It's really just a fantastic Magic card once you can actually play it. And then Valky, just it's all-around lead. It's all-around decent. It's card advantage, which is something that a deck like this does not get a whole lot of. Same with Professor Onyx. Card advantage on a Planeswalker is actually really good for a deck that really wants to present itself as mono black, because otherwise there's just not a whole lot of card draw. But again, these provide a valuable element to the deck, and in some ways effective win conditions too. However, the deck has a couple of other win conditions and some cards that don't see a whole lot of play and yet are really effective looking in this list. The deck plays a single copy of both Blot Out the Sky and Starnheim Unleashed, which is really interesting. These are some of the only white cards in the main deck outside of like one other removal piece. But really, really interesting cards to just carry silver bullets of, Starnheim Unleashed can sometimes just make, 4 angels in the super late game, which is often when you're going to cast this. But even if it only makes like 2 or 3 angels, it's still going to be really difficult for a lot of opponents to deal with, especially once you've gotten to the point of the game where they're effectively just run out of resources. Same thing's true of Blot Out the Sky. If you don't draw this until late in the game, or if you just hold it until, again, your opponent is just out of resources, they don't have many cards in their hand, or they don't have any cards in their hand, for that matter, Blot Out the Sky seems like it could be very, very effective. This deck also gets access to Vanishing Verse, the only other white card that it plays, but it's important to bring up, Vanishing Verse has appeared in a couple of these decks in this video, and I do think it's a really, really good removal piece right now. This deck also plays Solemn Simulacrum to help fix what little mana you need to fix in the deck. If you need to cast your Valky, Solemn's in the deck for you, but this also effectively draws cards. You can cast it no matter what mana you've got open. It's a chump blocker, all kinds of cool things about Solemn Simulacrum. The deck does need that little bump of ramp that it provides. Maze Mind's Home was another great way for a deck that doesn't usually have access to card draw to actually draw some cards. And then finally, Palaka Predation is probably one of my favorite inclusions in this deck because it is a 4 of, believe it or not. But, you know, the deck could play main deck Duress or Agonizing Remorse if it wanted, but I really like the inclusion of Palaka Predation here because this can take certain counterspells out of the opponent's hand if that's what you're looking for it to do. But this is also going to take out Goldspan Dragons and All Runes Epiphanies and Emergent Ultimatums, Elder Gargaros, Professor Onyx, just any number of game-winning cards in Standard right now. If you're trying to protect one of your own planeswalkers, you can grab a Binding the Old Gods out of your opponent's hand. You know, you can grab the Yorion that they bought out of their hand. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with Palaka Predation right now, and it's kind of the deck's like counterspell in a way. It's kind of a counterspell that you don't have to wait for them to actually cast the spell. That's how the deck gets the gall to call itself a control deck, even though there's no blue in it. It's because we basically have proactive counterspells in the form of Palaka Predation and a bunch of sideboard hand disruption. And I will always have some small amount of respect, not only for a deck that calls itself a control deck but doesn't carry counterspells, but also for a deck that calls itself mono black control and yet clearly plays cards that are not strictly black cards. But the deck has whittled its way down from Abzan control to effectively very nearly mono black control at this point. And that's something else that I'm always going to like every time I see it is mono black control. So the deck has a lot of things that check a lot of boxes for me as a Magic player specifically. And it can go toe-to-toe too, right? It doesn't look like it would be the kind of deck that could go into these extremely long, grindy, card advantage-based matchups like we see a lot of in Standard nowadays, but it actually can, right? Cards like Maze Mind Tome, Solemn Simulacrum, Palaka Predation go a really long way, and once we can resolve a Planeswalker and keep it on the battlefield for a few turns, again, the deck can do some really, really cool stuff with that situation. So, you know, draw a bunch of cards with Tybalt Affection effectively, right? Just basically close the game out with an Ugin. There's just a lot of sweet stuff while also getting access to a lot of awesome sweepers and removal along the way. So not actually a bad deck that doesn't run out of resources as quickly as a typical mono black deck does. So there you have it, my top 3 off-meta decks for Strixhaven Standard, and there are more off-meta decks. If anything, there might be some that you find cooler than this. I'm going to leave a link to Mtg Melee, which is where I get all of my tournament results and stuff, in the description down there, along with all the deck lists and whatnot. Remember, those exist. As well as links to, you know, social media, Patreon, Twitch links and stuff like that. So lots and lots of stuff in the description down there. Make sure you check it all out. But I'll leave a link to Mtg Melee down there. Just go to deck lists, slide the slider all the way down to other deck lists, and you will find all kinds of fun stuff in that tab. Aside from that, just make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell for the noties, and get down there into the sideboard to tell me how you felt about this one. You know, any decks you felt like I should have covered, any tech that I missed or anything like that. You know, obviously I can't go into like massive tech for each deck, but if there's anything especially important that you feel like I missed, make sure you hit me with it down there. So aside from that, just do all the YouTube stuff and do the things and Patreon, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind. I banged the crap out of my knuckle on the table just then. It hurts a little bit. Love you. Bye.